recording, do the security. And I'll hand it over to Sean.
Welcome everyone to the 2021 New Orleans Poetry Festival. It's nice to see some familiar faces in here. I'm Sean from the NOPF board. Before we get started, we'd like to thank our major sponsors, the New Orleans Jazz and Heritage Foundation and the Academy of American Poets, who have helped us keep this year's fest free and open to all. We got a couple more events coming up. You can go to nolapoetry.com to check those out. There's an event tomorrow night and Friday night, and then we are off the air after that. So check out that calendar and come to the next couple events, and thank y'all for being at this one. Now I'm going to turn it over to JP, who will be moderating this session, the Hyper-Poetics of the visual narrative.
Okay, cool. Thanks. Welcome to the panel on the Hyper-Poetics of the visual narrative. Real quick couple of notes here. Originally, Amy Catazano and I came up with the idea, but Amy was busy at the time this was supposed to go on, so she couldn't be here, but I do want to just give credit to Amy Catazano for some of the ideas that went into putting this together, even though I'm actually not going to discuss what we were originally going to discuss, which was pretty much going to be multiversity by Grant Morrison. But I just want to get that out of the way. Two, the first person I picked to be on this panel after we started talking about it was Adam Crittenden, who can't be here because he's sick. But I just wanted to give a shout out to Adam, who is does a lot of cosplay, really into this stuff. You know, we've talked a little bit about the Marvel Cinematic Universe and things like that online and at in live IRL at AWP and stuff like that. So I just wanted to give a little shout out to him. Okay, now moving on. I'm going to start off with one of my improvisational talks, as I usually do for these things. Then I'll be handing it over to Rone Shavers, Wendy Chin-Tanner, Aristilde Kirby, and then Avren Keating will close out. We'll have some Q&A at the end, hopefully. Each person can say a little bit about what they're working on, what they're doing also, so that I don't waste time right now with a bunch of bio stuff, okay? But hopefully you've been following people on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, et cetera, and know a little something about what they've got going on. Really excited about this panel. And one more thing before I really get into what I really want to say is it was very important to me to make sure that this panel reflected the diversity of people who have been reading comics, reading manga, watching anime, and other like sci-fi, fantasy type stuff. I really want to make sure that our faces were here, especially when so often our faces actually aren't reflected in those forms. You know, yeah, we're getting Shang-Chi this year, but for a long time, there were no Asian people on the big screen other than maybe like an anime, and that was a cartoon form, right? So I want to make sure that was there. I want to make sure there were queer people here, trans people here, Black people here. Okay, now I'm going to get into what I do and what I was thinking about. So when it comes to the comic book, I'm not an encyclopedia. I have been dealing with a lot of books on comic book history recently. I've been really thinking about the philosophy of certain characters, psychology of certain characters, but I certainly, even with my favorites like Swamp Thing or Zatanna, I can't tell you from day one to today exactly how their lives are living. That you know, it's not my thing to be an encyclopedia of a particular character. But what I can say is, if you have questions about some of the history of some of these characters, you can ask me. If you have want to know anything about the history of comic books, you can talk to me. What I really want to get into is how a lot of times what we talk about when it comes to comic books is how they were influenced by the pulps. Over and over again, we hear that, you know, there wouldn't be Superman without Doc Savage. Obviously, I mean, he jacked his Fortress Solitude, even jacked his first name Clark. You know, there wouldn't be Batman without the Shadow. What we rarely talk about is actually how the comic books influenced paperback novels at some point, because what comics did over and over and over again was mashups and crossovers, especially as they were undergoing changes during the Comics Authority Comics Code. So when things like terror and horror were taken away, they had to manipulate how to tell these tales, and they had to work with little jokes and play with tropes, which are things we see now in stuff like Supernatural, X-Files, et cetera, a lot, and of course the pulp books at the time. So like something like Casper the Friendly Ghost is like, well, we can't really do horror, but now we'll make him friendly and goofy, and like that's something that they did that we didn't necessarily see a lot of before that, but now having that kind of stuff is very, very popular in paperbacks. We see a lot of paranormal romance, especially playing with the humor of a nicer, friendlier kind of ghost. Another thing that happened was as comic book sales went down, there were science fiction magazines and there were fantasy magazines, and there was weird science and there was weird fiction. And at one point, Dell was like, now it's weird science fantasy, because this is what he had to do to sell some books. So it was kind of a money grab, but the idea of science fantasy has still carried on. We still have science fiction and fantasy put right on top of each other together all the time. It's called Star Wars. Another thing that the comic books have done is allow for people to have a big, large multiverse. And this multiverse can include both their own particular universes as well as speaking to the outside world. So in the case of, I have a bunch of visuals, but I'm just not going to do it. I don't fucking feel like it. But you take something like Archie, where he can cross over with Sabrina, Greendale's down the road from Riverdale, right? But he can also cross over with his own universes, like the Archie horror comics can have the Jughead, the Hunger comics, crossing over with Vampironica, crossing over with the Betty and Veronica Vixen series, and at the same time be discussing the outside world. So in Jughead the Hunger and Vampironica, they make a lot of references to Clint Eastwood. They make references to the X-Files. They make references to Supernatural. So they cross over into other pop culture, into the outside world. At the same time, Archie is also crossed over into Sharknado, into Predator twice, into Punisher, and again, real world stuff, B-52s and the Ramones. This kind of thinking of allowing yourself to be in their world and outside the world at the same time is the kind of stuff that I tend to do. So I'm just going to read a little bit from a piece I wrote a while back. It's one of my last like poems. Like now I'm an anti-poet, but I'm just going to start this off. So change would require a choice. And as of last checked, there's too many swatches to choose from. In so many names, brand after brand, flipping pages, scrolling through, perusing the aisle, a choice would be a change. Hello. Have you met any old friends today? How about our Lord Greystoke? John Carter and Deja Thoris could have written another series of Martian chronicles from their thrones on Barsoom with more details, more intimate, more real. Did the dishes, washed the crown, fed hot dog, and went about a Riverdale misadventure of a day. And I have another one later on here. Optimus Prime never made any promises in the dream, and Starscream remained second in charge. But the clouds were silver, so silver, in fact, they were chrome. It was a sky the Borg would like if the collective could enjoy anything. The Holy Ghost turned out to be on the side of the Sith Lord. And I just want to read the very, very end of that whole thing here. So, Destiny called up the bright side to set a date to get a better look. King David took notes. It was empty. The hills have eyes, empty. Children of the Corn, empty. Lone Ranger found nearly dead by Tonto, empty. Holodeck, empty. Danger Room, empty. Never-ending story, empty. Somebodies were nobodies, empty. When the dreams came true. Just to wrap up with the last couple minutes I have here. Another thing that I want to get into was, in some ways, the pop artists were playing with comics, but they were actually doing this at the expense of the artistry of comic books. Rosenquist did not say nice things about the comic book artists. And the comic book artists at the time, especially the guys doing the romance comics for places like Dell and the first graphic novel, It Rhymes with Lust, were like, you couldn't make a comic book look like that because it didn't have enough detail to really tell the facial expressions didn't tell enough to get the emotions across. So in some ways, as much as the comic books have made it into pop culture, they were still thrown down as low culture. And I just want to put that out there. And yet to say, at the same time, there were cross-cultural things. So like, if you look at something like Tom of Finland, that kind of drawing, which was inspired by the Wild One, also came over to those romance comics, as I was talking about, that were under the comics code, so they couldn't draw women the same way. So what a lot of the romance comics did were start to draw the men with very, very tight outfits on and more muscles and bulges and things like that. And one of the weird things is that actually after the comic code goes away, now it goes back on the women. But that was something that is important to look at if you look at romance comics of the 50s and whatever's hanging around in the 60s. Some of that drawing can be very, very interesting, even though I'm not a big art person. In fact, I tend to really just look at the bubbles and kind of forget the comics. I'm really bad about some of the names of artists in terms of like their style. Like I can't look at a comic and go, oh, that's definitely this person. A lot of times I can't get that with the reading. I'll be like, that's definitely Jeff Johns writing. That's Cullen Bunn's writing, you know. But anyway, save some questions for me. I have a lot more to say, but I'm going to pass it off to Ron.
I need to unmute. Oh, well, hey, thanks, JP. Well, I do have a question for you immediately, and that's release the visuals. When are you going to release the visuals, JP?
People see too many of my memes.
Well, actually, it's okay because I have 0 visuals, but yeah, thanks for that. Although I mean, I bought maybe I'll try to wing something together in terms of visuals, but I don't know about all that. Anyway, yeah, thanks for the setup and the intro and everything else. Originally, I was going to talk about, hi everybody. My name's Rone Shavers. I'm the author of this tiny little collection called Silverfish, right? And originally I was going to talk about three different comics and how they kind of influenced my work. I'll put those in the chat in case you really want to, in case you're like desperate to check them out. One is called Mage by Matt Wagner, sorry. Right. Of course, there's the already awesome Dreadstar, right, by Jim Starlin, and you might have heard of him because he's the guy who made Thanos, okay. And then there is also the one I think I'm just going to focus on today, Transmetropolitan. Or no. Right? Okay, and I think I'm just going to stick with Transmetropolitan, especially given everything that you just said, right? Yeah, and in some respects, it's sort of odd because you know, you talk about, say, comics influence on paperback novels, et cetera, et cetera. We can get into it a little bit, but actually Transmet is, you know, it's, well, there would be no cyberpunk without, or, you know, like say you take something like, well, we'll get there. I get ahead of myself, but Transmet totally reflects a cyberpunk thing. It's also a direct influence on my work, but just sort of not in a way that you might think. Because Silverfish sort of, it's a book that takes place in an unnamed future. It's everything is sort of, you know, it has cyborgs, it's corporatized, and everything else. But that's all to say, to kind of get back to Transmetropolitan, it's a world that's similar to that one. However, what really, really struck me about that, and what I pretty much straight up stole in terms of my work, was just the level of detail that was there, you know, in terms of the setting. Just so much detail. You know, like the characterization, everybody's like, oh yeah, Spider Jerusalem. In case you don't know, he's a gonzo journalist. But you know, I find his character to be just a little overwrought, but in terms of the setting, just the intense, yes, but the intense sort of setting was really, really great. All the layers and layers of references, all the small, tiny little details that almost went nowhere. I took it all, except that paradoxically, I did this one particular thing, And that's in rather than just sort of describe it, right? The waste of space, how everybody's overcrowded, all the technological sort of fecundity, if you will, right? Rather than describe it, I maybe gave about 3 or 4 lines maximum to it throughout the entire work. Why? Because I realized that the barest of settings was enough, because comics like Transmetropolitan, Judge Dredd would be another one. Actually, and if you really want to kind of do the lineage, Transmetropolitan, the visual look and the style of Transmetropolitan owes everything, say, to Blade Runner, a bit of Alien, et cetera, which goes all the way back to Mobius in Heavy Metal, doing a story called The Long Tomorrow, which if you want to go full literary circle too, that's he's kind of drawing on like The Long Goodbye and Pulp and all the kind of hard-boiled books to make a truly sort of like original sort of sci-fi thing. And if you, for those of you guys who might not have read Transmetropolitan or don't know, just imagine, or even Mobius or that kind of stuff. The look of Mobius also pretty much defines, say, The Fifth Element, for example. That would be another very, very Mobius influenced movie. But like I was saying, sort of, I didn't really have to, I didn't really want to kind of do that much because it felt, again, sort of overwrought. Like the work had already been done for me. Okay, so, kind of to mention a kind of mega city or in a futuristic landscape, that was just enough to kind of spark a reader's imagination with me, because the visual cues, the visual clues were sort of, they'd already been imprinted, especially when you think about, say, all the comic series that I mentioned above. I didn't have to make the reader work too hard. There wasn't a need to kind of reinvent the wheel, right? Not when I could let the visual language of comics, that kind of sort of, so we say that deep visual knowledge, the deep knowledge, not when I could let it just do its work. So in a way, an attentive reader, what I kind of found was that an attentive reader will craft his or her own particular image according to that style of artwork. So I didn't have to really like go that deep with it. But as a writer, what I could also do is just direct the reader's attention to other aspects of my text that I wanted them to pay attention to, more so than just the image. So it's not overwrought. It's not overly sort of expository. It's like, this is a bowel disruptor and this is what it does. You don't need all of that because okay? So then why Transmetropolitan? Why Transmet? The book helped me to understand how to kind of layer a kind of visual information, even that supposed layering was kind of stripping it away. By just mentioning certain things or mentioning certain styles, I could approach exactly what I wanted to without having to overburden the text. I could kind of rely on a visual minimalism to evoke the kind of maximalist images that are in all these futuristic cityscapes. And so in this instance, less was more because it gave me more room. And that's pretty much it. I'm just going to pass it on. So thank you so much.
Hey there, I think that means I'm up. Hi everyone, I'm Wendy Chin-Tanner, and I write in a bunch of genres. Poetry is my first love. I'm the author of 2 poetry collections, Turn and Anyone Will Tell You. And I also am a graphic novelist. I co-authored the graphic novel American Terrorist. I also publish graphic novels, which is what we're going to be talking about today. And I am a novelist and a sociologist as well. In sociology, my areas of specialization are race, ethnicity, discourse analysis, and cultural production. And I have a novel forthcoming with Flatiron Books called King of the Armadillos, which is a story set in the 1950s, partially set in Louisiana, in Carville, Louisiana. Today, though, I'm going to be talking to you with my comics, publishing, and poetry hat on. I edited and recently released a new comics poetry anthology called Embodied. Can y'all see this? Embodied, an intersectional feminist comics poetry anthology. So I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about that this evening, constructing an intersectional feminist comics poetry anthology. When I'm not writing poetry or fiction, I'm making comics at A Wave Blue World, the independent publishing company for graphic novels, anthologies, and art books that I founded with my spouse, Tyler Chin-Tanner, in 2005, the same year we got married. After 15 years of keeping my literary life fairly separate from my comics life, I decided in 2020 that it was time to combine my literary experience and network with Tyler's background in comics and anthology curation for our latest anthology, Embodied, an intersectional feminist comics poetry anthology. From a personal perspective, editing this book during the pandemic, while homeschooling our 2 daughters and taking care of my elderly high-risk parents was challenging, but also exceptionally intimate and rewarding. I'm grateful to have had an opportunity to create something beautiful and uplifting at such an ugly and scary time. From a political perspective, A Wave Blue World's mission has always been socially conscious. And at this moment in our country, the rights of people of marginalized genders and identities have been more under threat than they have ever been in my lifetime, even under this new administration. Look at the transphobic legislation that just rolled out in Arkansas. Look at the resurgence of anti-Black and anti-Asian hate crimes. Look at the continued state-sanctioned terrorism of the police and the continuing refugee crisis. In the past few years, as part of my literary activist work, I have been curating intersectional feminist readings and panels and discussions, so editing an anthology with that mission and ethos seemed like the natural next step. From the networks that Tyler and I have built in over a decade in comics and in poetry, we assembled the most regionally, generationally, and ethnically diverse array of non-cis male poets and artists that we could find in recognition of the full breadth of intersectional feminism. This includes all of our colorists and our letterers as well. As a guiding principle, we emphasized the inclusivity of underrepresented communities, and as a result, the majority of our contributors in Embodied are BIPOC and LGBTQ+. I think we're in a period of an expansion and change in both poetry and comics. There are a lot of creators out there who are pushing the boundaries of what those mediums can do. I love the way anthologies allow us to take risks as editors and publishers with everything from new concepts to new talent. They're an excellent way of practicing good literary citizenship because they can provide a large platform for a larger number of emerging and underrepresented creators than, say, individual graphic novels can. Comics poetry is a hybrid creative form that mixes the syntax of comics and poetry. Tracing its origins to illuminated manuscripts, graphic novels, concrete poetry, and poets who combine image and text, comics poetry has become formally established in the past decade, as a number of artist poets have begun independently publishing collections and projects. Embodied is an example of the comics poetry form, and it's the first anthology of its kind, not only in the fact that our contributors are all non-cis male poets and artists, but in our interpretation of the form itself. Rather than illustrating the poems or simply depicting images from them, we chose to adapt each poem into its own sequential art narrative. In collaboration with the poets and artists to varying degrees, Tyler and I came up with the scripts, oversaw how they were interpreted, and then decided, along with the letterers, how to lay out the verse so that the poem and its art would amplify each other, making each story greater than the sum of its parts. Each poem is printed in its original form at the end of each story in order to showcase the process of transformation that it underwent. We also have process drawings at the back of the anthology, giving even more insight into how each story was created. So now I'm going to do a little screen share, and I'm going to show you 2 exclusive stories that haven't been previewed anywhere else. So. All right, so this is Drown by the Washington, D.C. based queer Black poet Venus Thrash. I don't know if y'all know her work, but if you don't, you should, because she's incredible. And her story, her poem Drown, was illustrated by Y. Sanders. She also goes by Natasha Sanders, and the letters were by Cardinal Ray. "10 summers gone since we made love nonstop in a shady hotel while Chelsea, New York vibed below us, me with pink eye and you still wanting to kiss my devoted mouth, your plump lips on mine. Lingering like the moment I first learned to swim, tossed into the deep end, rising naturally for air. Knowing then no rushing waters can ever claim me, nor empty promises we dared not make as we returned to regimented lives, never again to touch, to palm your ample breasts in my hands, caress curves enough to match my own mercy. To nibble the tender nipple, to flick the jewel between my teeth, you in a downpour, and I catching rain on my tongue." And here's the poem in its original form. Now, I think that this poem in and of itself is a tour de force of erotic poetry, much in the vein of Sappho and all the greats. So. And the second story that I wanted to show you is mine. Based on my poem Birth, with art by Miss Lasco Gross and letters again by Cardinal Ray. And my inspiration for the art and the story that went along with the poem here was kind of imagine if one of the old guard was giving birth. Bone-scraping labor is nothing like the pangs that racked me for days after the vacuum emptied my womb, and what spilled from me was bleak and nacreous. For years, I was tethered to terror, led by the nose, a beast pierced through its septum. I had cast veils over it, defiance, denial, and though it had left my sight, smoke still issued from my mouth as if I had swallowed fire, as if its violence had smoldered and sunken down into ash, live embers still glowing. Now, in these volcanic surges, in the burning ring as she crowns, she leaves my dwindling starless night. As sacrum and pelvis and inward spiral let go, I yield, I open. My body turns itself inside out. And here's the poem in its original form. It's in a trisyllabic tercets, or what I like to call 3x3s. All right, and I'm going to stop the screen sharing. So as both a poet and a graphic novelist, I'm drawn to poetry and comics for many of the same reasons. While their toolkits might look different at first glance, both forms engage with distillation, the use of silence, the relationship between different parts of the page, and the interaction between visual content and negative space. They invite the reader to infer their own meanings in the interstices between panels, line breaks, and stanzas, making dramatic use of a kind of imaginative ellipsis built into the structure of their forms. As such, this interpretive openness requires more participation from the reader than, say, prose, and therefore offers a more deeply engaged, collaborative experience. In embodied, dramatic tension is created not only within the narrative of the stories themselves, but in the interplay between form and content, different panels and pages, and between the artwork and the script. Combining poetry and comics in this way amplifies the openness of the theatrical complicity inherent in each of those forms individually. In other words, in comics poetry, what doesn't appear on the page is just as important as what does. To understand the intersectional feminist literary praxis at work in this anthology, We can turn to Rachel Blau Duplessis's notion of writing between the lines as a form of literary language. What is the meaning of what is said in the context of what is not said? Each of the comics, poetry stories, and Embodied answers this question in a variety of different ways. Thanks so much. I'm going to leave it there.
I guess I'm next. Hi, everyone. My name is Aristilde Kirby. What do I say about myself? I don't know. I guess first thing I'll say is that like I don't have a large sort of thing prepared because I was kind of a last minute addition to the party, but I'm here to party with you nonetheless. And I have a lot to talk about in regards to how much, I guess, say like anime and manga has impacted my own practice. I think I remember when I was just like 7 years old. Oh, wait. Okay, no, it's fine. I thought, okay, it's fine. Yeah, I think I remember when I was like, would go to school and I would just talk with my friends about like Dragon Ball Z and Sailor Moon. I remember I went to the doctor's office and she had a bunch of Sailor Moon action figures and I was like, I want the Mercury one. And she was just like, fine, you can have it. Stuff like that. And fan fiction was actually my first sort of real venue towards writing. I would write Mega Man fan fiction. I used to collect the Sonic the Hedgehog Archie comics. I had one of my own personas. We're not going to talk so much about that, but I did. Yeah, fan fiction was a very big sort of start. And I think, yeah, watching a lot of anime, a lot of cartoons, reading a lot of comics. I remember reading like Crisis on Infinite Worlds when I was like 11. I was just like, storytelling is just like, this is like blew my mind for what it was. Later, when I was a teenager, I got into like Love and Rockets, and that started to sync up with a lot of my taste in literature, like 1,000 Years, like 100 Years of Solitude by Gabo Marquez, where and a lot of where Love and Rockets comes in, like with the Luba stories especially, it kind of like spins off and has like these magical realist sort of things. And Love and Rockets starts off as like this weird, like almost like sci-fi comic, and then it starts to just like expand everywhere else. So just, I think the main thing for me is that comics, anime, cartoons just sort of exploded what was possible in a narrative, what was possible for an image. I'm going to show you something real quick from this book by Sasaki Maki called Ding Dong Circus. It's a Maki. She was an artist in like in the late 60s and 70s, and she was part of like this sort of magazine scene called Garo, and they specialized in gekiga, which is like a sort of like underground sort of alternative comics to like the mainstream of just like shonen or shoujo or seinen. And I think being in that sort of space led a lot of artists to sort of play with the form or even like what was even possible. So I'm going to show you a page real quick from that. And then I'm going to talk about how it impacts my symbolism. So here we see like an angel, a moon on this harbor. Then we see like this rabbit going up a shadowy flight of stairs. And yeah, we have like this dark scene. There's like a knife and there's like a cup of coffee, a waiting woman, this weird starry pattern. Got this precarious scene. And yeah, it's just like, and this is all part of one story, by the way, but this is just an example of how this sort of gekiga artists sort of like exploded what narrative conventions were. And I loved, and reading this when I was like maybe in my early 20s, it was more like, I was just like, okay, it had a more surreal sort of psychedelic sort of approach to it. And it was very inspirational because I made my own, like I try to make my own poetic forms. Some of my poetic forms, which is called the Vajra macrogram. And it's
I don't know if you can hear us, but you're kind of cutting out. If you can hear us, you might try turning off your video and we'll just listen to you. Oh, I think she's gone.
Hello.
Hey, now we can hear you.
Okay, cool. God, I sorry that happened. I don't know where I left off. I started talking about my own poetic form, didn't I?
I think it was before that.
Before that?
Mm-hmm.
Wait.
You had just finished talking about Gato, and you were starting to get into your
About Garo,
own,
right.
yeah, and getting into your own poetic form is where I heard it cut off.
Thank you, Avren. I appreciate that. So yeah, I showed you some of the pictures and like sort of the high flights of symbolism that were being used there. It was in this like sort of psychedelic surrealist realm. And I read this maybe more like along my early 20s for the first time. I really want to shout out literally all of like the translators and scanlators that make this sort of thing happen, because it's been extremely important, especially as a trans person, where it's just like people going out of their way for no money in order to bring a story to people is literally like the most important thing, and it changes so many lives, including mine. But anyway, yes, Ryan Holmberg, you know the vibes. Yeah, shout out Breakdown Press, Seiichi Hayashi, Flowering Harbor, Red Room. There's so many great Gekiga sort of stuff out there. But even in the mainstream, like today I watch a baseball manga. I mean, I watch baseball anime called Ace of the Diamond, and it's just so good to see homosocial relations that are just like just cool. Like, I don't know, like, it's guys being guys, but it's cool. It's not harmful. It's not toxic. It's pretty sick. And the guys are cute, and that's cool too. God damn it. And so yeah, getting back to my own poetic form, can I screen share? Is that possible? It is possible.
Yeah, let me make you a co-host. You'll need to be a co-host.
I just wanted to show everyone how it works, how it's impacted my own practice in regards to the sort of surrealist style of the psychedelic style of the Gekiga, and like sort of like the piling of images. And we are doing this right now. Yes, we are. So yes, this is the Vajra. Like I make sort of like these, I know it's going to be like these 5 stanzas, and I usually make like an excess of 5 like little sort of haiku sort of bits, and then I choose which ones kind of sometimes at random, and then I just sort of slide them together into place. So it gives so I'm writing the things individual. I'm writing the little haiku-esque fragments individually. It leads to like sort of like weird new connections. So it kind of like makes me think that sometimes I'm making like an exquisite corpse with myself. Like one hand doesn't know what the other's doing, and when they sort of collide, it makes like a sort of new association between images that I hadn't really considered. And I want to say that like manga and anime with like all of the weird poetic flights that it takes sort of really directly inform this sort of process. So I'll just read you, I guess, one example. Usually when I read the Vajras to people, I just sort of like shuffle it, and then I bring it all together at the end, and people are just like, whoa, I didn't even know that that's how it happened. But you can see it here, so kind of the curtains being drawn. But anyway, I'm going to read you the last stanza, starting at 13. 13. And they ride in each other's cars, stereo blasting Bjork, talking mess or dissolving scars. 14. Porikura and eel tempura, ice cubed shiso leaves in tequila, breath on the glass. 15. Sunlit picnic on the mountain, a mantis trims the wind's bangs by a shrine. split end spread red. And now I'm gonna read it all together. And they ride in each other's cars, purikura in il tempura, sunlit picnic on the mountain, stereo blasting Bjork, ice cube shiso leaves, a mantis trims the winds talking mess or dissolving scars in tequila, breath on the glass, bangs by a shrine, split ends, bread, read. So places where that sort of happens. I like to, yeah, I think, and especially for like, so I'm releasing a new chapbook of these sort of poems that I made called Daisy and Catherine 2 to the second power, which is like a sequel to another chapbook that I did, but it's not really important for me to go into that there. But that entire, like I had these two characters that I kind of made and I wanted to do more with them. And, you know, they're in a sort of like weird relationship with each other that's very much informed by a lot of shoujo manga from like the group of 24, which is like this very, oh no, my connection's unstable. Am I still here? Oh no, okay, cool.
Still hear you.
Sick. And I'm gonna, yeah, and I'll finish soon. Yeah, by the group of 24, like Moto Hagio, who takes a lot of inspiration, like the Poe family Ichizoku, the Song of the Wind in the Trees, the Poem of the Wind in the Trees. What else? Ryoko Ikeda, Onisama A, which is like just is a very much a lesbian shoujo manga that really, and that whole group of people just sort of like break gender roles and gender lines and just sort of like freak things out. All of the boys are just like really androgynous and wispy. And this, that, and the third. So yeah, I feel like we can kind of, I can kind of leave it there. I mean, I do a lot of, also I'm going to start doing translations from the Spanish of manga in my own time, actually. The first thing I'm going to do is this, is a series, like I'm going to do my own scanlations of this book called Deathko by Atsushi Kaneko. It's about a sort of a girl who's like a kind of grim reaper, and she belongs to a secret society of reapers. Atsushi Kaneko is very much inspired by Western sort of ideals of like art and this, that, and the third. And it's still manga, but you can see all of like the punk, psychobilly influence bleed through. And I think I'm really excited to, start my own thing and put work into the world that I feel should be shared, that can hopefully entertain other people. Yeah, so be on the lookout for that. Follow me on Instagram at ARISTILDING. And I do believe that is that. Thank you for having me.
Okay, I think I'm up, so I'm going to share my screen with you. Ignore my very cluttered. Oh wait, I can just show you the PowerPoint. You don't have to see my horrible desktop. All right. So today I'm going to be talking to you about manga poetics. Aris already just gave us a really great rundown of the history of alternative manga. I first want to give credit and many thanks to Kenning for organizing all of this behind the scenes, for putting in all of the effort that you have. I really appreciate it. My goal for the talk is to give credit where it's due. My own poetry comics are deeply influenced by Clamp, specifically their manga Clover, which is the manga I'm going to use as an example with the manga poetics toolkit. Wendy actually mentioned something very similar to it earlier. I really just hope that the people here will come away with this having new ways and new questions to engage the manga that they're reading. So what do you do when you find yourself face to face with manga poetry in the world? I want to show you Clover, and I'm going to be leaning a lot on lectures by Stephanie Burt and Alexander Rothman. I'm going to share Stephanie Burt's, one of her definitions of poetics with you, because it's the one I'm using to look at manga, and one I also kind of just use in general, which is poetry is a set of practices of ways of reading and writing that grew out of a history of verbal objects, often made of language that many people have called poems. Most of these things have line breaks. Most of these things have strong emotions in them. Many are related to singing. Many are related to expressing a unique personality. So you'll have a better reading experience if you don't go into every poem with the same set of expectations. Not all poems are sonnets. Not all poems have line breaks. Poems were not all written in the same historical context, etc. So thinking of it in terms of a practice and what it's doing with the world around it is, I find it to be a much more helpful way of reading. So here we have a page from Clover. What I would like us to do when looking at this page is consider the visual parataxis that's happening. So parataxis is a kind of syntax where you repeat a similar phrase. Here we have Sue falling asleep in 3 very tiny cramped segments in a way that's showing fragmentation of the self and also slowing time down. So when we're looking at panel layout, it's opening up multiple possibilities. It's creating jumps in time. It's pointing out the emptiness that surrounds the characters. It's also pointing towards the audience. It is making an explicit statement that it's being read by the way that it is segmenting these images. The audience is inextricable from the art. And that's a quote that I got from this book, Over the Line, edited by Williams and Humberston. I don't know if you can see it. Really helpful book. So another way of looking at manga poetics is how do the words and the images interrelate? How do they transform each other, converse with each other, negate the other? What is the typeface doing? So in this image here, we have I seek happiness in a kind of like cursive stylized font versus the dialogue, which is in Comic Sans. What is the mood and affect that's created when we're looking at these different typefaces? How is the writing acting as a visual entity? I'm also interested in looking at the keiyu in the background, which are the background effects. They're especially prevalent in shoujo, where you'll have like lightning or fuzzy bubbles, or various different kind of action lines to give energy or to give an impression of a time. So we're gonna look more at Clover. In a nutshell, it is a comic about a cyberpunk dystopian future done in an Art Nouveau aesthetic. I believe it's harkening back to the Taisho period of manga, which was influenced deeply by Parisian fashion magazines. The manga takes up themes of compartmentalization, queer kinship, and an intertwined reality. It goes backwards and forwards a lot in time, and unfortunately, it was never finished. It was discontinued in 1999, I believe, when the magazine it was being serialized in folded. So here we have our protagonist, Sue, who's on the far right. She's a 4-leaf clover. She is stuck in a cage, and she can never leave. She contacts this woman, Aura, who's on the not so far right, because she picked up Aura's singing through like the atmosphere and sound waves, and they grow a really quick, intimate bond. And the way that Clamp shows you this bond is through these visual rhymes here, where you have pretty much a similar placement of the characters, but they're different. Through the rhyme, you're interrelating their present. We also have lyric. I would not say it's great. I'm not a fan of the poetry itself, but it is there. It says, now come close to me, I'll sing an endless song. God, please show me the deepest red, the truest love. And then here we have love on the left, but it is outside of the text square. It's pointing towards the emptiness that surrounds the characters, a reality that is unattainable, it is untouchable to them. So what I find really useful as an artist is Clamp's use of this white space, its non-linearity, its courage to incorporate lyric and image together in the 90s, pointing towards a kind of queerness within the lyric and within the panel layouts that younger generations might find really helpful. I certainly did when I was a young teenager reading this. So the illustration here, it kind of like is the cherry on top of like the queer cake for me. It's essentially like, it's showing Aura and Sue together in this kind of green world space. Their bodies are melding together. But what's interesting is it really brings back the question of audience. Like, what is this image created for? Is it something that Sue wished she had with Aura? Is it something that was created in order to like titillate a manga reader into buying the book? Is it both? The erotic nature of their relationship is left unstated, but it is inferred through the poetics of the manga itself. So here is a drawing I did of Canis, the myth of Canis, who was raped by Poseidon. He felt bad about it, granted her a wish, and she wished she could become a man. And Canis becomes a man who is indestructible. Centaurs get really pissed with him, crush him with boulders, and he dies. So here we have a trace of like I think it's a frieze of centaurs crushing Canis. And what I find really helpful here in comparison is the panels in Clover, which also show this like breakdown of time progression. And when I adopt that kind of fragmentation into my own poetics, I think of how the myth itself was constructed and then how it's like a long line of telephone through time and space. And for people like me going back and trying to find ourselves reflected in myth, it's distorted and we're left with emptiness in a lot of the places where there could have been fullness, but it doesn't really exist. And here's another image I did with the same project of Canis. It's unpublished right now. And I saw somebody ask earlier about like if the words were created after the image or if the process all happened organically. I would say that that's how I'm working. I don't have a poem that I then break up into an image. I kind of try to figure them out side by side together. I also have some images, I don't know how much time I have, related to poetry comics that I've done in chalk. Again, I haven't digitized these, so the chalk's a little messy. But I'm really interested, again, in Clover's use of white space, the ability to tightly compartmentalize images and what that means within the space of a page. So anyway, thank you. I definitely have many questions for the panelists too, so I appreciate everybody's attention. Oh, and I also have a ton of works cited. I also have a like 40-minute long presentation I created that I had to completely cut down in order to do this in 10 minutes or however long I've been here. So thank you.
Thank you to all the panelists. Am I on? Yeah, there we go. Yeah. So thank you to all the panelists. If there are any questions, just start shooting them at us. Unmute yourself, ask us some questions. One thing I didn't mention early on that I did want to mention was, and Wendy kind of touched this in terms of how interactive a comic book can be, because it talks about, it relates to kind of cool and hot media with like Marshall McLuhan. One thing I should point out is obviously he did his books with lots of pictures. There were also actual comic books called comic books, made as comic books, with where they didn't have very good artists, so they actually did all photos and stuff like that. And I see that as a precursor to the meme also. And I wouldn't call my memes Vizpo. I actually call them micro essays, but that's neither here nor there. But anyway, questions, people. Including Avren, if you have a question you want to ask right now.
Yeah, I was really curious, Wendy, your work in organizing and collaborating with these artists and poets is like super fascinating. I'm really excited to get the collection. And I was curious about what the process was like in sort of figuring out the placement of the text with the image. What did the poets really want to like prioritize in that process?
Yeah, I mean, that was probably one of the most difficult pieces of the puzzle, you know, because like, to take my poem as an example, it's a formal poem, right? Like, it's experimental, but it's a formal poem. It's written in trisyllabic tercets. So how are you going to translate the look of a trisyllabic tercet, you know, which is 3 syllables per line, 3 lines per stanza, that's kind of like syncopated down and up the page? How are you going to translate that into captions for a graphic novel? You know, there, much like in translation from one language to another, I think there's some kind of implicit loss that's going to occur, and you have to make choices around what you're willing to lose in order to gain something else, essentially. So for each story, those choices had to be made anew, and those were specific to, you know, a kind of like collaborative strategizing, you could say, between all of the parties that went into it. It's a team sport. I think that comics are much more of a team sport than many other literary media, and I think, you know, people don't quite realize that. And sometimes you can do it as a tag team, but something that I found that was really, really cool about doing Embodied was that it was less tag team style and more collaborative in real time. And so, you know, we had a lot of conversations about making those choices, and that those choices were very much dependent on the mood, the content, the style of each individual story, which are so different and diverse in this book. So I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
Can I ask another question? Is that weird?
No, go ahead. Good.
Okay.
This is what I wanted. Good.
Oh, somebody else asked a question. I'll mute myself until that's addressed.
You can ask a question. It's really more of a comment, it seems like.
Oh, okay. Aris, I'm really interested in like the use of chance in your poetry. I'm curious about like how manga has inspired you to like have this element of uncertainty, of kind of like collaboration with time and with chance. I think that's really fun and fascinating.
About my relationship with chance in my poetry. Chance operations, as Cage would say. Let's see. I mean, how does manga impact that? I think, It's hard to say. I think it's hard to say. I don't know. I'm always looking for different levels of expressivity. I think, like I said before, with the Vajra, I sort of make a surplus, and then I sort of like, it's like, I want this one, I want this one, I want this one. We'll see what effect it has. I think that's basically it. I think I'm always working for another sort of, looking towards new frontiers of expressivity in text and chances a way to access that sort of thing. Just like, and like I said earlier, it's just like I'm making an exquisite corpse with myself in this sort of way. And once I realized that that was what was happening, I was just like, wow, this is so cool, to me anyway. So yeah, I don't know, going back to, I don't know, to Saki Maki and like her whole thing being, I guess, on a psychedelic bed, I think it kind of comes from that. And I also have this other sort of, from Picture Box, it's called World Map Room. And really, like, look at this. It's just like what is like, it doesn't look like anime as we know it.
And it's also using like visual, it's using the eye to rhyme, like it's using the onomatopoeia in order to like create the poetry. Like that book is amazing. I've only been able to see excerpts, but it's really cool.
Yeah, very much so. And it's just
Yeah.
like, and when I think about, and it's just, if you have some idea of like what I've done in the past in regards to concrete poetry, like I wanted to do something I wanted to make something that was visual, and I wanted to do the thing that you just said, where it's just like things rhyme in unexpected ways, or maybe they don't rhyme. The poem makes its own syntax through its form, and I think that's really important to me, and I think that's something that's really that comics gave to me. Making a visual language, constructing itself, being meta sometimes. I love the Clover and how sparse it is with, with the panels and with the words. It's just like, yeah. And yeah, I want to say that like shoujo comics just gave me a whole new way to approach beauty in literature, because a lot of times they're comorbid, right? On the back of the Sasaki Monkey book is a sort of little caption by Haruki Murakami. It's just like I've watched. There's a line of anime called World Masterpiece Theater in Japan that's literally just adaptations of books. Anne of Green Gables, there, so many things. So it's very important to me, and it will continue to be really important to me. Thank you. They also did Little Women, which obviously has its own.
The one thing I was thinking about when you were talking, and you brought up Cage, I was thinking Ted Jones also, kind of with chance operations and that kind of thing, and him being much more surreal than Cage, and that's just a comment, not really a question, but that's where my mind went automatically, is to Ted Jones. But one thing I was thinking about also is, in terms of, there's something that the visual narrative can do that in many ways a written piece can't do. And I'm going to jump over to Saul LeWitt with conceptualism, and he was talking about how the visual narrative is much closer to a song. And I was thinking like that really works with somebody like a Ted Jones, who's basically doing jazz on the page. But I was also thinking about how important comic books were to a lot of hip hop artists of a certain time. Like obviously, I mean, the Wu-Tang all like take their name, have different names related to comic books. And I was just wondering if anybody had any thoughts on the sound of comics, like the sound of manga, because I think that's really interesting. It's a silent form, and yet there's a sound to it. One of the things I was pointing out in a book that I was reading recently was that there was a point where all television and movies were black and white. The only color you really got were the comics, and that was really interesting. But at the same time, they still act like a silent movie. But if anybody had any ideas on thinking orally with this, because it's also dialogue, please. Or not, maybe that's just me. Maybe I'm the one who's thinking about it, because for me, I really see a relationship. Okay, go on.
Yeah, I think you're totally right. Like automatopoeia, sound poetry, it's just like in so many ways, like comics had sort of assimilated that and made it into its own. Ring, flask, like it's just like you can hear it in your head. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. Let me think a little bit more about. But I think you're totally right.
Like I think without like, you know, doing a whole nother fucking talk here, is there's such a similarity between comic book the comic book and playwriting and screenwriting. And I think that can be very interesting, although obviously actually even with the poems, because verse dramas, and like obviously the first fucking big poems were stories and epics and things like that, but there's just sometimes it gets taken away from comics what they really were able to accomplish with a lot of dialogue, and you know, and it really changes, I think personally, how one thinks about writing, taking away a lot of metaphor and simile sometimes, because you don't have to say this looks like that. There's already a thing there, you know, and that can be very interesting.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's really kind of like a really good music video when you're watching the music video and it's not like a direct literal interpretation of the lyrics. And what I found really cool that Wendy was showing was like where the artist went with the words, and like how you're able to like build off an image already and draw those parallels without explicitly stating it. In regards to rhythm and verbalizing like the comic itself, like if you verbalize, like if you read out loud the onomatopoeias, it sounds real silly. And there's something about that that's really fun. And also it gets you to pay a closer attention to like the world that's being created and what font the onomatopoeias are in. It'll get you to read differently. It's really prompting your engagement, I think. I think you're totally right, Kenning.
Yeah, it's super seductive, and it's just like, even like, I don't know, a lot of experimental processes, like how do we get people to do this thing? And it's just like, I feel like comics and cartoons just have it down pat. And also one thing I really wanted to highlight is how cartoons and comics, they're so good at doing the most with less, like with like especially animation studios and budgets, where it's just like they'll take a frame and they'll just like shake the screen a little bit with some like impact lines, and that's just like, wow. It's just like most people don't really know, or people don't even notice the drama is being conveyed anyway. They're really magicians, honestly.
And it wasn't my plan to ask a bunch of questions, but as moderator, I guess I'll do that. So here's another thing I was thinking about a lot, because one of the books I was looking at was thinking about comics as thought experiments, and I love like what ifs, and obviously I started off with mashups and crossover kind of thing. So one of the things I was thinking about is, there's something in you that finds something of interest in having the same characters going through different situations that you can look at in terms of as a relationship to maybe the writing prompts or something like that, or like really just philosophical thought experiments. I mean, that's one of the things I really like. I always say that in many ways, the long-term serials, like something like Plastic Man over fucking 80 years, he'll be 80 in a couple months, so I just had to bring him up, is that a character like that his character doesn't really develop, and the plot doesn't really develop. It's just different situations, so it allows him to do his things. This is very much like writing prompts, I think. But if you have any ideas like that, and even the comic itself is a writing prompt, which will kind of lead into ekphrastic tomorrow. But if you have any ideas on these, on that, then chime in.
I've heard with manga. I've seen theorists talk about how because manga's characters are much more abstractly rendered than like American comics, they have like more, you can project onto them more, and I think there's something there about like the character being a kind of stand-in for your own sort of mental projection and your own way of like dealing with certain scenarios. You're kind of playing it through them. But I don't really have much else to add other than like I have thought about this abstraction, and I think that that's a way of really engaging the reader.
All right, cool. If no one has anything else to add, any other questions here, I didn't miss anything in the chats, did I? Then I guess we can go then. Thank you to everybody that spoke tonight. Check out everybody's work. Follow everybody on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, et cetera, all that stuff. And have a good night.